The humid air of northern Florida in 1856 carried the salt spray from barrier islands and the calls of herons wading through marshes. Between the St. Johns River and the Atlantic coast, the rigid structure of plantation slavery pushed against something older and untamable. In the weathered slave quarters of the Whitmore plantation, a child entered the world who would transform from whisper to legend to the ghost story that haunted overseers in their sleep. The midwife Rue, whose hands held 3 generations of healing knowledge, sensed immediately that this birth was different. During the new moon's absolute darkness, a single candle refused to stay lit. 3 times Rue set flame to wick, and 3 times an unfelt wind extinguished it, forcing her to work by touch alone, her fingers reading contractions like Braille as she guided the infant into an unprepared world. When the child emerged, she didn't cry. She simply opened eyes that seemed to hold amber flecks even in profound darkness, staring at Rue with an intensity that caught the old midwife's breath. The mother, Celia, had worked the Whitmore fields since age 6. Her body bore slavery's encyclopedia of cruelties. Whip scars crisscrossed her back like brutal maps. Her hands were calloused thick as leather from endless hours under the merciless Florida sun, and her spirit had been worn down by a system designed to break human beings into tools. She had been bred, as the Whitmores termed it, as if she were livestock, to a man she barely knew from a neighboring plantation. He had been brought over for one night and returned, his purpose fulfilled in the plantation's grotesque arithmetic of human reproduction. The transaction was noted in the plantation ledger with the same clinical precision used for recording horse matings. But when Celia held her daughter for the first time, something shifted in her resignation. The child's skin was darker than her own, a deep brown that seemed to absorb and hold light rather than reflect it. Her fingers, though tiny, gripped with surprising strength, and those eyes captivated Celia, seeming to contain a wildness the plantation hadn't learned to tame. In that moment, holding this strange and beautiful creature, Celia felt something she thought the plantation had beaten out of her years ago. Not the desperate hope of survival, but something more dangerous, the hope that this child might somehow escape her predetermined fate. They named her Zora after Celia's grandmother, who had been born in Africa and carried to her grave stories of a land where black people owned themselves, built cities, forged iron, and answered to no master but their own conscience. That grandmother had practiced what plantation owners called witchcraft and what the enslaved community called Hoodoo, a system of folk magic, protection, and spiritual warfare that had traveled across the Middle Passage in the minds and hearts of people stripped of everything else. She had known how to read signs in nature, craft protections from roots and bones, and call on ancestors and spirits to intervene in a world determined to crush her people. She had been sold away when Celia was young, vanished into the vast machinery of the domestic slave trade, dragged south to Louisiana's sugar plantations, where most enslaved people didn't survive 5 years, but her legacy remained in whispered techniques for healing, hiding, and small acts of rebellion the masters never quite understood. Rue had known that grandmother. She had learned at her feet, absorbing knowledge older than American slavery itself, traditions reaching back through centuries of African spiritual practice. Now, looking at this strange child who had come into the world under such peculiar circumstances, Rue recognized something. She had seen only once before, in Celia's grandmother in those final days before being sold away. It was a kind of power, a connection to forces existing beyond the material world of cotton fields, auction blocks, and ledgers recording human beings as property. From her earliest days, Zora was different. While other children in the quarters learned quickly to make themselves small, to avoid white attention, to move through the world with downcast eyes and muted voices, Zora seemed incapable of such diminishment. She walked with her head up, small shoulders squared, as if she carried invisible armor protecting her from the weight of subjugation crushing everyone around her. She looked white people directly in the eye, a transgression that could result in brutal punishment. At 2 years old, she wandered from the quarters and was found in the main house sitting in the parlor, touching piano keys with curiosity. The sound that emerged was not random childhood noise, but something almost resembling melody, As if her fingers knew where to fall without being taught, the overseer Garrett, whose cruelty was legendary, wanted to whip her immediately. He was a tall man with a face weathered by Florida sun and eyes holding no warmth, no mercy, no recognition of the humanity of those he was paid to brutalize. He reached for his coiled leather whip, the one he kept oiled and ready, the one that had opened the skin of dozens of backs. But something stopped him. Later, he would tell other white men that he'd felt sudden, sharp pain in his chest, constricting like an iron band tightening around his ribs until he couldn't draw breath. His vision blurred, his legs went weak, and for a moment he was certain he was dying. The sensation was so intense that he dropped the whip and stumbled backward, gasping. Then, the moment he stepped away from the child, the moment he turned his back on T, Ho's strange, amber-flecked eyes, the pain vanished as suddenly as it came, leaving only a dull ache and profound unease. He never touched Zora after that, though he made Celia's life harder in retaliation, adding extra hours to her labor, reducing her rations, finding excuses to inflict punishment for imagined infractions. Celia knew they couldn't stay. The knowledge came gradually, building like storm clouds on the horizon, then all at once, the certainty that this child would not survive the plantation's particular form of slow murder. Zora was 5 years old when Celia began planning their escape in earnest. By then the girl's strangeness had become constant whispered conversation in both the slave quarters and the main house. The enslaved community spoke of her with reverence and fear, seeing something that might protect them or bring harsher retribution. White people spoke of her with unease, sensing something unsettling to the natural order they believed was their birthright. Strange things happened around Zora. Dogs trained to track runaways would circle her and then sit, refusing their master's commands, whining as if in pain. White people who looked at her too long developed sudden headaches blooming behind their eyes like thorns, forcing them to turn away. The smokehouse padlock mysteriously opened when Zora stood near it one winter evening, allowing the enslaved community to take meat that would otherwise have been locked away, keeping them from starving during lean months when rations were cut. Once an overseer's normally docile mare threw him when he'd raised his hand to strike Zora, rearing up with such violence that the man was hurled from the saddle. He broke his collarbone in the fall and left the plantation shortly after, claiming the place was cursed. Rue, who had become something like a grandmother to the child, began teaching Zora deliberately what she had previously taught in fragments and secrets. They would meet in the woods at dawn before the bells summoned the enslaved to the fields, or in the deep of night when the moon was dark and the plantation slept. Rue showed her how to read the signs, the way moss grew on trees to indicate direction, the patterns of stars that could guide travelers north toward freedom, the herbs that could heal or harm depending on preparation and intent. She taught her the old words, the prayers drawn from traditions predating the Christian religion the masters tried to force upon them. She taught her ways of asking the spirits for protection and guidance, of creating charms that could shield against evil or bring misfortune to enemies. And she taught her something more dangerous, something that could get them both killed if discovered. She taught her that she was not property, that the world the plantation owners had built was not natural or inevitable, but constructed by human hands, and therefore able to be destroyed by human hands. She taught her that the chains were real but not eternal, that the system of slavery was vast but not invincible, that every empire built on blood and suffering eventually crumbled into dust. Zora absorbed everything with a hunger that sometimes frightened even Rue. The child seemed to understand instinctively what others had to be taught laboriously. She could identify plants by touch in complete darkness. She could sense when danger was approaching before it arrived. She dreamed of things that later came to pass, the overseer's broken bone, a fire in the cotton barn, a white man's sudden illness. The other children avoided her, unnerved by her intensity, by the way she seemed to exist partially in some other world they couldn't perceive. The catalyst came in autumn 1861. The Civil War had begun that spring with the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and the plantation's white men were leaving to fight for the Confederacy's right to keep human beings in chains, with fewer overseers and more chaos, with the structure of authority weakened and distracted, Possibilities for escape had widened slightly, but patrols had also intensified, and punishment for attempted escape had become more savage as plantation owners tried to maintain control over a system beginning to crack at its foundations. Celia knew they had to go before Zora got older, before the plantation could begin using her body in the ways it used all black women's bodies. The girl was 10 years old now, no longer a child, but not yet fully a woman, existing in that dangerous threshold where the plantation's predatory attention would soon focus on her with full force. Already Garrett had started looking at her in a way that made Celia's stomach turn, a calculating appraisal she recognized because she had seen it before, had experienced what came after. She would die before letting it happen to her daughter, on a moonless night in October, when darkness was absolute and autumn air carried the first hints of coming winter. Celia and Zora disappeared from the quarters. The final decision came suddenly, triggered by something Zora had seen in a dream. She had woken 3 nights in a row with the same vision: men with dogs, chains, blood on the ground, and Garrett's face twisted in triumph. On the 3rd night, she had gone to her mother and said simply that they had to leave now, that if they waited, they wouldn't be able to go. Celia had learned to trust her daughter's instincts, these premonitions that seemed to arrive like messages from some unseen realm. They took almost nothing. A small sack of cornmeal Celia had hoarded over weeks, a knife she had stolen from the kitchen and sharpened until its edge could split hair, and a small cloth bag Rue had pressed into Zora's hands just before they left. The old woman had gripped the child's shoulders with surprising strength, her eyes bright with tears and something fiercer, a kind of ferocious pride. Inside that bag were roots pulled under specific moon phases, herbs dried and blessed with words in a language older than English, a few small bones from animals that had died natural deaths, and a piece of paper covered in symbols that meant nothing to Celia but that Zora seemed to understand instinctively. They slipped out of the quarters 2 hours after midnight, when even the most vigilant overseers had surrendered to sleep and patrol riders had passed on their circuit. The night was warm for October, humid and heavy, and the darkness was so complete that Celia could barely see her own hand in front of her face. But Zora moved through it with confidence, leading her mother by the hand, navigating by senses Celia didn't possess. They headed east initially toward the river, moving in the opposite direction from where runaways typically fled. Most escapees headed north immediately, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the plantation, following the North Star toward some vague promise of freedom. But Zora had insisted they go east first into the swamps and coastal marshlands most people avoided. They waded into the St. John's River as the first grey light of dawn began thinning the darkness. The water was cool and murky, reaching Celia's waist and Zora's chest. The current was gentle, and they moved with it, letting the river carry them downstream while using their hands to push away from the banks. They had been gone less than 6 hours when the alarm was raised. Old Isaiah, who rang the bell that summoned the enslaved to their labor, noticed immediately that Celia and Zora were missing from the morning count. He hesitated, his hand on the bell rope, wrestling with a decision that could mean the difference between life and death for the runaways. Isaiah was nearly 70, too old to run himself, too worn down by decades of bondage to harbor much hope of freedom. But he remembered Zora, remembered the strange things that happened around her. In that moment of hesitation, he made a choice. He rang the bell at the usual time, as if nothing was wrong, and said nothing about the missing woman and child, until the overseer made his own count an hour later. That single hour of delay would matter more than Isaiah could have known. By the time Garrett discovered the absence and the decision was made to summon slave catchers, Celia and Zora had put crucial distance between themselves and the plantation. They had left the river and entered coastal marshlands, a labyrinth of sawgrass and standing water, of hammocks of solid ground surrounded by channels too deep to wade and too shallow to swim, a landscape that seemed designed to swallow people and never give them back. Leading the hunting party was Silas Crenshaw, whose reputation for brutality extended across 3 states, and whose success rate in recovering runaway slaves was nearly perfect. He was a professional hunter of human beings who had made a fortune from others' suffering and approached his work with the cold efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped seeing his quarry as people. He traveled with 6 trained bloodhounds, animals bred and conditioned to track human scent across any terrain, and brought 3 other white men who shared his profession and his complete absence of mercy. When Crenshaw arrived at the Whitmore plantation late that first morning, he listened to Garrett's report, while his eyes scanned the quarters, reading the landscape, calculating angles and distances. The dogs picked up the scent trail easily enough, following it to the river where they circle. Dee and whined in confusion. Crenshaw watched them with narrowed eyes, reading their behavior. They followed the river downstream for 2 miles before the dogs picked up the scent again where bare footprints were clear in the mud. The trail led away from the river now into the coastal marshlands, and here the pursuit became more difficult. By evening, they still hadn't found them. Crenshaw called a halt, his jaw tight with frustration, but as darkness fell and the slave catchers made their camp, strange things began to happen. One of the men saw something moving in the marsh grass, a shape that seemed human but moved wrong. When he fired, the shape was gone. The dogs became agitated as full darkness arrived, whining and pulling at their ropes. One of them began to howl in a way that made the men uncomfortable. Not the baying of a dog on a scent, but something higher pitched, almost like a scream. And then there was the fire. Twice during the night it went out, despite there being no wind and the wood being dry. Each time they relit it, and each time it burned normally before suddenly dying, as if smothered by invisible hands. Miles away, hidden in a dense thicket on a hammock surrounded by water, Celia and Zora huddled together. They had no fire, no shelter beyond interwoven branches above them, no food except cornmeal mixed with marsh water into thin paste. Celia was exhausted, her feet bleeding from cuts sustained moving through sore grass. But Zora seemed almost energized, her eyes glowing in the darkness, whispering words Celia didn't understand, her hands moving in patterns over small objects she'd arranged in a circle around them. The second day of the hunt began badly for Crenshaw and his men. When dawn broke, they discovered 2 of the dogs were gone, their ropes not broken but untied, the knots carefully loosened as if by human hands. The remaining 4 dogs Rifu, said to track, cowering and whimpering despite their master's curses. The lead hound was found dead, its body stiff and cold with no marks of violence or disease. It simply looked as if the animal had been frightened to death. They pressed deeper into the marshlands, following a trail that seemed almost too easy to read. By midday, they had entered a part of the marsh that seemed different. The water was darker, almost black, and it smelled of decay. The trees grew strangely, their trunks twisted and branches reaching out at odd angles. The silence was profound. No birds called, no insects buzzed. One of the men reported seeing the girl standing in a thicket watching them, but when they reached the spot, there was nothing. The sightings continued throughout the day, each man at different times reporting seeing her, sometimes close, sometimes far away, always watching with those strange eyes. By the time they made camp that second night, the party had traveled perhaps 10 miles deeper into the marsh and seemed no closer to catching their quarry. That night, as Crenshaw lay awake listening to the sounds of the marsh, he found himself thinking about all the stories he'd dismissed over the years about slaves who claimed to have protections against their masters, about root workers who could curse white men, about African practices that had survived the Middle Passage. For the first time in 20 years of hunting human beings, Silas Crenshaw felt something approaching fear. They found the first charm around midday of the 3rd day, hanging from a low branch directly in their path, a small construction of bones and feathers and Spanish moss tied together with what looked like human hair. The moment Crenshaw's knife severed the cord holding it, the temperature dropped suddenly. His horse whinnied and pulled at its reins, eyes rolling white with fear, and from somewhere in the dense vegetation came a sound almost like laughter. They found 3 more charms over the next 2 hours, each one more elaborate than the last. By late afternoon they had reached what appeared to be the heart of the marsh, a place where water spread out into a wide, still pool surrounded by ancient trees. And there, on a hammock of solid ground in the middle of the pool, they saw her. Zora stood perfectly still, her ragged dress hanging loose on her small frame, her bare feet planted on the earth as if she'd grown there. She was looking directly at them with those eyes, and Crenshaw could see now what his men had meant about them glowing. As Crenshaw raised his rifle, Zora raised her hands above her head in a gesture that looked like benediction or curse or both. Her lips moved, speaking words that carried across the water, and the world around Crenshaw began to change. The water started to move, rippling and churning though there was no wind. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. And from the water, from the trees, from the earth itself, shapes began to emerge. Human-shaped but wrong, too tall or too thin or moving in ways bodies shouldn't move. Dozens of them rising from the dark water, stepping out from behind tree trunks, materializing from the air itself. Some wore chains that rattled as they moved. Some bore marks of violence on their spectral forms, whip scars, brands, missing limbs. One of Crenshaw's men screamed and fled, spurring his horse back the way they'd come. Crenshaw held his ground a moment longer, his rifle still trained on Zora. He fired, but even as the bullet left the barrel, he knew it wouldn't matter. The bullet struck the earth at her feet, and she simply smiled, a terrible smile that held no childhood in it at all. Crenshaw broke then, his legendary composure shattered like glass. He wheeled his horse and fled, riding as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind him, he could hear them moving through the marsh in pursuit, their chains rattling, their voices raised in wordless cries that spoke of centuries of suffering demanding justice. He rode for hours, or maybe just minutes. Time had lost meaning in the panic of flight. When he finally stopped, he found himself alone in a part of the marsh he didn't recognize. He was lost, completely and utterly lost. For the first time in his adult life, Silas Crenshaw felt what the people he hunted must feel, the terror of being prey. Meanwhile, Celia and Zora were miles away, moving steadily northwest through a different part of the marsh. Zora had collapsed after her working, and Celia had carried her daughter on her back for the first hour before Zora recovered enough to walk. When they rested, Zora explained that the tall one might survive if he was lucky, but he wouldn't hunt runaways again. She had put something in his mind that he wouldn't be able to forget. There were tears on her cheeks now as she apologized for frightening people like that, for making them see their worst fears. Celia held her daughter close, this child who was both victim and weapon, both innocent and terrible in her power, and told her not to apologize for fighting back, for doing what she had to do to keep them alive. The journey north took 18 days, and each one tested them in ways that made the pursuit by Crenshaw seem almost simple in retrospect. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping during the day in whatever concealment they could find. They ate what they could forage, and Zora's powers manifested in strange and unpredictable ways during this period, as if constant danger was forcing them to evolve. She could sense when patrols were near, could guide them away from danger before it became visible, could sometimes convince animals to approach or flee as needed, but each use left Zora weaker, more drained, her young body struggling to channel forces it wasn't quite ready to handle. On the 7th night, they had their closest call. Following a creek northward, they heard voices ahead. Celia pulled Zora into the shadows beneath an overhanging bank just as a Confederate patrol came into view, 6 soldiers in grey uniforms moving along the creek bank. They were so close that Celia could have reached out and touched the last man's boot as he passed. She held her breath, one hand clamped over Zora's mouth, both of them pressed flat against the muddy bank, while the patrol walked by. One soldier stopped directly above where they were hiding, looking right at them, except he wasn't seeing them. His eyes passed over the shadows beneath the bank without recognition. After he moved on, Celia looked at her daughter. Zora's eyes were closed, her face tight with concentration, sweat beading on her forehead. She had made them shadows, made their eyes slide past without seeing, but she was too tired to do it again that night. On the 11th day they encountered other runaways, 4 people from a plantation near Valdosta who had been running for 6 days. The woman who gave her name as Sarah looked at Zora with something approaching awe, saying she'd heard stories about a girl who could do things, who sent slave catchers running back to their masters. They traveled together for the next 3 days, the larger group providing safety in numbers, while Zora's abilities helped them avoid patrols and navigate difficult terrain. On the 14th night, they reached a river they couldn't wade across, a wide, swift-flowing body of water that would require swimming. On the far bank, visible in the moonlight, they could see what looked like military fortifications that could belong to either Confederate or Union forces. Someone had to get close enough to see their uniforms, hear them talk, figure out which side they were on. Finally, Zora spoke up, saying she could hide better than any of them, and had ways of protecting herself if something went wrong. After brief argument, Celia reluctantly agreed. They watched as the small figure slipped into the water, swimming smoothly and quietly, barely disturbing the surface. Within minutes, she'd reached the far bank and vanished into the shadows near the fortifications. The wait was agony. An hour passed, then 2, the moon moved across the sky, and still there was no sign of Zora. Dawn was perhaps an hour away when Zora finally reappeared, emerging from the water with an exhausted smile. They were Union forces, the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment. She had gotten close enough to hear them talking, saw their uniforms, even spoke to one of the sentries. He was a black man, in a blue uniform, carrying a rifle, and when she told him they were runaways, he said to wait until full light, and then come across openly. He said they'd protect them. They waited until the sun was fully up before attempting the crossing. One by one they entered the water, helping each other across. As they swam, soldiers on the far bank watched them, rifles ready but not aimed. When they finally dragged themselves onto Union-held ground, dripping and exhausted, a black sergeant came forward to meet them, saying they were safe now, that the United States Army protected all people fleeing from slavery, that they wouldn't be sent back or harmed, that they were free. Celia collapsed onto the ground and wept, great wrenching sobs she'd been holding back for weeks, for years, perhaps for her entire life. Around her, the others were crying too. Only Zora remained standing, looking at the soldiers with those strange luminous eyes, taking in the sight of black men in uniform, armed and respected, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of others. Over the following hours, as they were processed and fed and given clean clothes, as their names were recorded in official federal documents for the first time, as people rather than property, the story of their escape began to emerge. Of Zora's abilities spread quickly through the camp, growing and transforming with each retelling until by evening she had become something like a celebrity. Soldiers stopped by to see the girl who could work hoodoo, who could strike white men down with curses, who had called up spirits to protect her escape. Zora handled the attention with quiet dignity. She answered questions when asked, but didn't elaborate or dramatize. When a white officer asked her to demonstrate her abilities, she politely but firmly refused, saying it wasn't a trick or entertainment, that it was something she did when she needed to survive, when her life or her mother's life was in danger, and she wouldn't do it just to prove she could. That night, in a tent provided by the army, Celia and Zora lay side by side on clean blankets. Outside they could hear the sounds of the camp, the sounds of a world at war, but also the sounds of a world where they were, no longer property, where their lives belonged to themselves. When Zora asked what happens now, Celia thought about all the possibilities that had been closed to them just weeks ago and were now opening up. They would live, she said. They would figure out what freedom actually meant, what they wanted to do with lives that were finally their own. Behind them, somewhere in the dark marsh, Silas Crenshaw would eventually find his way out 3 days later, half-starved and completely broken, his hair reportedly gone white from whatever he'd experienced. He would never hunt runaways again. The story of the slave catchers who vanished into the Florida marshes pursuing a woman and child would spread. Some versions said the hunters had been killed by alligators or drowned in quicksand. Others whispered about hoodoo and conjure, about a girl who could command spirits and strike white men down with curses. The enslaved community would hear these stories and pass them along, adding their own details and interpretations, transforming Zora from a real child into a legend, a symbol of resistance that grew larger with each telling. But the real Zora, the actual 10-year-old girl, was simply trying to survive, trying to get herself and her mother to safety, trying to live long enough to see what freedom actually looked like beyond the abstract idea of it. She was powerful, yes, but she was also tired and scared and far from home. She was both the legend and the child, both the weapon and the victim, both the terror that haunted slave catchers' dreams and the daughter, who held her mother's hand as they walked through darkness toward an uncertain future. Their story would spread, would become legend and myth, would inspire other enslaved people to believe that resistance was possible, that the masters were not as invincible as they pretended to be. Some versions would exaggerate Zora's powers, would make her into a supernatural being rather than a child with strange gifts. Other versions would diminish them, would explain away what happened through coincidence and luck. But the truth that Celia would carry with her for the rest of her life was simpler and more profound than any legend. Her daughter had been born different, had been given powers by heritage and ancestry and forces beyond understanding. And when those powers had been needed, when their lives had depended on it, Zora had used them not for revenge or destruction, but for the most basic and fundamental purpose, to protect her mother and herself, to claim the freedom that should have been their birthright, to survive in a world designed to destroy them. In the morning they would begin to learn what freedom meant in practice. They would discover its complications and disappointments, would learn that being legally free didn't automatically erase the trauma of slavery or eliminate the racism that had justified it. There would be hard days ahead, struggles and setbacks and moments when freedom felt like just another form of precarity. But that night, in that tent on Union-protected ground, with her daughter sleeping peacefully beside her for the first time in weeks, Celia allowed herself to simply feel gratitude. They had survived. They had escaped. They had taken their lives back from people who claimed to own them. And if that wasn't everything, if freedom would prove more complicated than the simple binary of enslaved or free, it was still enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The child who turned slave catchers to shadows became more than just a person who escaped slavery. She became a symbol, a story, a promise that resistance was possible even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Her tale would be told and retold through generations, would inspire and comfort and challenge. And though the details would change with each telling, though some would believe and others would dismiss, the core truth would remain. In America's darkest chapter, in the heart of a system designed to reduce human beings to property, a 10-year-old girl had found power that the masters could neither control nor comprehend, and she had used it to write her own story of freedom.